One billionaire drove home that night with nothing in his heart but silence. But it was the dog, just 1 month old, just lost his mother, who heard something no one else could. A soft cry beneath the snow. A soul forgotten. While the world kept moving, Max stopped, barked, insisted. And when Dorian followed him into the cold, he didn't find a threat. He found a 70-year-old woman collapsed by the road, alone, confused, and invisible to the world. What came next was not rescue. It was reunion, redemption, and the quiet beginnings of love. This is the story of a tiny pup, a guarded man, and a stranger who turned out to be family. Before we begin, hit like, subscribe, and tap the bell, because some stories find you when you least expect them. Boulder, Colorado. Late January. The snow had been falling relentlessly since early morning. Thick, slow flakes drifted from a sky the color of steel, settling into silent layers over pine trees' rooftops and winding mountain roads. The air was bitter, the wind sharp with the scent of frost and cedar. In the distance, the city of Boulder rested beneath a white shroud, its twinkling lights muffled beneath heavy clouds and silence. Dorian Hale sat behind the wheel of his charcoal gray Range Rover, heading north through a forested pass just outside the city. At 38, Dorian was the sort of man who could walk into a room and freeze the air with a glance. Tall and lean, he wore his tailored overcoat like armor, his salt and pepper hair always immaculately trimmed, and his steel-gray eyes spoke of a man who had built empires with little more than willpower and distrust. A self-made billionaire, Dorian kept people at a distance with practiced precision. Grief, too, had shaped him. Losing his mother at 12 to a slow illness had carved something cold and permanent into his soul. Nestled on the passenger seat beside him, wrapped in a wool blanket, was Max. Max was a golden retriever puppy, only 1 month old. He was small for his age, the last survivor of a litter, struck by a sudden virus. His fur was fluffy and light gold, his ears too big for his round face, and his wide dark eyes still held that innocent softness found only in very young creatures. Dorian had not meant to adopt a dog, especially not one this young, but when he'd seen Max curled alone in the corner of the breeder's shelter, something inside him, long quiet, had stirred. They had been driving home from Denver, where Dorian had spent the afternoon in back-to-back meetings. It was nearly 7 p.m., and darkness had already settled over the highway. The heater hummed softly, snow flicked against the windshield in streaks, and Dorian was focused on getting home before the weather worsened. Until Max barked. It wasn't loud, just a single sharp yip that made Dorian glance sideways. Max had sat up, ears perked, his tiny head swiveling toward the window. "What is it?" Dorian asked, brow furrowing. Max barked again, twice this time, and scrambled clumsily onto the console. His tiny paws slipped on the smooth surface, but he pressed his nose to the passenger side window, whining with insistence. Dorian's grip tightened on the wheel. He scanned the snowy roadside. Nothing. Another bark, high-pitched, urgent. Against his usual instincts, Dorian slowed the car. Max was never this agitated. The puppy was usually quiet, especially on drives. Dorian pulled over beside a snowbank, the tires crunching over the ice. The road was empty, the forest dense and hushed on either side. Max yelped again, scrambling toward the driver's door now. Dorian sighed. "You better not be doing this because you want to chase a squirrel." He wrapped Max back in the blanket and stepped out into the cold. The wind sliced through his coat like knives. As soon as he set Max down, the puppy wriggled free and bolted toward the tree line. Max, Dorian called, alarm rising. "Hey!" But Max didn't stop. He darted through the snow, leaving a trail of tiny paw prints. Dorian cursed under his breath and followed boots crunching through the white. The forest was dim, the trees crowding in, but there through the veil of snow, he saw Max barking beside a heap of something. Clothes, trash, no. It moved. Dorian hurried forward. The shape became clearer, a hunched figure curled into itself. A woman, old, frail, half buried in snow. She wore a thin wool coat and house slippers. Her white hair was matted with ice, and her hands were red and stiff from the cold. Her eyes blinked slowly, lips blue with cold. She murmured something, but the sound was lost in the wind. Ma'am Dorian knelt beside her, his voice steady, despite the chill in his blood. "Can you hear me?" She didn't answer, only looked past him with a vacant stare. Max whined and pressed his body against her, trying to offer warmth. Dorian's mind kicked into gear. She wouldn't survive much longer out here. He shrugged off his overcoat and wrapped it around her shoulders. She was frighteningly light, her body limp like a forgotten doll. "I've got you," he whispered. Lifting her gently, he trudged back toward the car. Max stayed close to his heels, glancing back as if to make sure she was safe. Back at the vehicle, Dorian laid her across the reclined passenger seat, turning up the heat. He retrieved an emergency blanket from the back and tucked it around her. Max climbed up beside her and nestled at her hip, tiny tail thumping, once, then still. Dorian stared at them both, this stranger pale and shivering, and Max looking up at him with quiet purpose. He took out his phone and dialed emergency services. "I need an ambulance," he said. "Female, 70s, found unconscious on Forest Loop Road just outside Boulder." "Yes." "Yes, she's breathing but barely." As he hung up, he sat back, chest rising and falling with a strange tightness. He didn't know this woman's name. He didn't know how she'd ended up here alone in the storm. But he knew this. If not for Max, she would have died tonight. He reached down, scratching gently behind Max's ear. "Good boy." Max licked his fingers in reply. Outside, the snow kept falling. The road back to Dorian's secluded estate cut through the woods like a dark ribbon laid across a white canvas. Snow continued to fall in whispering flurries, and the air outside was sharp enough to bite through wool. Inside the SUV, the heater hummed, fighting off the cold clinging to the windows. The old woman, still unnamed, lay reclined in the passenger seat, bundled in 2 blankets and Dorian's thick overcoat. Her breathing was shallow but steady now, and Max had curled up at her side like a silent sentinel. Dorian glanced at her again as he turned onto the final stretch of road. Her hair, long and silver, framed a face that might have once been striking, now softened and faded by age. Wrinkles etched the corners of her closed eyes, her lips slightly parted in restless sleep. Whatever had brought her into that snowstorm was lost in the fog of her mind, but it lingered in the faint tension still visible in her brow. He didn't know why he hadn't waited for the ambulance. The dispatcher had promised it would arrive within 15 minutes, but Dorian had felt an urgency he couldn't explain. She had already been out in the storm for who knew how long. He couldn't shake the feeling that time was fragile. The gates of his property creaked open, triggered by the silent code from his dashboard. The mansion loomed ahead, a stone and timber structure nestled into the hillside, modern yet warm, built with the intention of comfort, but long deprived of it. Most of the rooms were dark, the security lights casting pale glows across snow-dusted glass panes. Dorian parked in the side garage, wrapped the woman tighter in the blankets, and carried her into the house, with Max trotting anxiously behind. The warmth of the interior hit like a wave. Radiant heat pulsed from the floorboards, and the scent of pine logs lingered from a fire burned earlier that morning. Dorian set her down gently on the tufted chaise in the den and knelt beside her, checking her pulse again. "Still with us," he murmured. "Barely." Max stood on his hind legs, placing his paws gently on the edge of the chaise. Dorian glanced at him. "Watch her." He returned moments later with a first aid kit, a warm towel, and a fresh bottle of water. As he dabbed gently at the woman's temples and coaxed her lips open for sips, a low moan escaped her throat. "Ma'am," he said softly, "can you tell me your name?" Her eyes opened slowly, pale blue, clouded, uncertain. "Do you know where you are?" She blinked at the ceiling, then at him. Her lips formed a soundless shape. Her gaze drifted to Max, who now rested against her leg. "Warm," she whispered finally. Dorian exhaled. "Yes. You're safe now." The rest of the night passed in slow, careful rhythms. Dorian moved her upstairs to the guest room, the only one besides his own that had been kept ready. The bed was soft, the sheets clean, and the walls held a few of Sarah's old paintings, soft strokes of lavender fields and gentle skies. Sarah had painted them before she died, when color was her protest against fading life. Max refused to leave the woman's side. When Dorian tried to coax him out, he simply circled once laid beside her with a huff and placed his chin over her thigh. Dorian allowed it. He turned off the main lights and let the room fall into dim amber from a lamp near the bed. She had already slipped back into sleep breath, deeper now, her hands slightly curled over the blanket. In the hallway, Dorian paused, leaning against the wall. The house was too quiet again. But this time, something was different. There was presence. Life. The next morning arrived with soft winter light, peeking through frosted windows. Dorian brewed strong coffee and stood barefoot on the heated kitchen tiles. Max patted and tail-wagging slowly. He stretched, yawned, then sat at Dorian's feet with an expectant look. "You stayed the whole night," Dorian murmured, crouching. She must have made quite an impression. Max wagged his tail and gave a low, affirmative woof. Dorian ruffled his ears. "Let's go check on her." They climbed the staircase quietly. The guest room door was half open. Inside, the woman sat propped up in bed, dressed in one of Sarah's old knit sweaters, her frail shoulders nearly lost in the folds. She looked around with timid curiosity. Her eyes landed on Dorian. "This isn't my room." "No," he said gently. "You were found last night in the snow. You don't remember." She frowned, then shook her head slowly. "No, only trees, cold, and a dog." Dorian gestured to Max, who patted in happily. Her face softened. "Yes, him. We don't know your name yet." Dorian continued, stepping closer. "Do you remember anything else? Anything at all?" The woman looked down at her lap. Her fingers were trembling. "I don't know. I don't think so. Do you want me to call someone? I don't know who to call." Dorian nodded. "Then we'll figure it out. No rush." She looked at him, then really looked this tall man with a quiet voice and tired eyes. "Thank you," she said. Dorian offered a tight smile. "You're welcome." Later that morning, while preparing the guest room more comfortably, Max began pawing at something near the base of the armchair. Dorian knelt beside him and uncovered a small bundle that had been tucked into the lining of the old coat the woman wore. Inside was a folded, time-worn piece of paper. On it was a faded name, June, 2009. Alongside it, a crinkled photo of a young woman with kind eyes and sunburnished skin smiling in front of a garden full of lavender. Dorian stared at it for a long moment. Max nudged his hand with his nose. "Well," Dorian said, voice low, "looks like we might have a place to start." He placed the items in a small box and tucked it into the drawer beside the guest bed. Max, satisfied, circled and flopped onto the rug with a sigh. That night, Dorian checked on the woman one last time before bed. She was already asleep, Max curled beside her. The box remained untouched on the nightstand, a quiet reminder that some stories are not lost, just waiting to be remembered. The snow had stopped by morning, leaving behind a soft, sparkling crust across the hills. Boulder's sky stretched clear and blue above the mountains, but the cold lingered sharp in the wind and the echo of breath. Inside the mansion, warmth hummed quietly through the walls, and in the guest bedroom, sunlight streamed across the bed, where the old woman still slept, her breathing steady, her fingers slightly curled into the wool blanket. Dorian stood at the kitchen island phone, pressed to his ear. His other hand moved absent-mindedly over Max's head. The puppy sat loyally at his feet, tail curled around his body, ears flicking at the distant hum of the espresso machine. "Yes," Dorian said, his voice firm but calm. "Found her yesterday evening. No ID, no bag, no emergency tag. About 70 white hair, 5'3", maybe 100 pounds. Fair skin, pale blue eyes. Dressed in a thin coat, no gloves, no memory of her name." On the other end, a nurse from Boulder General Hospital responded with kind professionalism. Her name was Linda, mid-40s with a warm, gravelly voice that sounded like someone who'd worked long nights and still greeted people with a smile. "We haven't had any missing persons reports matching that description recently," Linda replied. "But let me run it through our last month intake logs. Can you send over a photo?" Dorian glanced at Max. "Give me 20 minutes." He hung up and leaned against the counter, watching Max look up at him expectantly. "You ready to help again?" Secretary Max yipped and stood tail wagging, clearly proud of his promotion. It took a little effort to coax the woman into letting him take her picture. She had bathed and dressed in another one of Sarah's soft sweaters, this one lavender gray, and sat at the window seat overlooking the back garden. Her hair had been gently brushed, and she looked at the snow-covered yard with a distant reverence, as if trying to remember why it felt familiar. Dorian crouched beside her, phone in hand. "May I take a photo?" he asked gently. "Just for identification, to help find your family." She nodded slowly. "I suppose, if it helps." It did. Within 2 hours, Linda called back. "We might have a match," she said, her tone lifting. "There's a patient who was discharged from our memory ward 3 weeks ago, Mavis Langley. Her daughter signed her out against our recommendation citing a private care arrangement. Last known address was Aurora, Dorian wrote it down, eyes narrowing slightly. And there's no contact. Now, none. But the file has an emergency number for a June Langley. He felt a jolt recalling the name on the scrap of paper Max had uncovered. Can you give it to me? I'm afraid I can't release that directly. But if you'd like, I can reach out and pass along your contact info. Dorian exhaled. Please do. After he ended the call, he stood for a moment in the hallway outside the guest room. The name Mavis felt strange on his tongue, but also solid. Real. A thread pulled free from the tangle of confusion. He looked down. Max stood beside him, head tilted. That's her name, Dorian said. Mavis. Max gave a soft bark as if satisfied. By afternoon, Dorian and Max headed into town. Mavis had fallen asleep again after lunch, vegetable soup, and 2 slices of toast, which she ate slowly but contentedly. She didn't seem frightened anymore, just tired. They stopped first at the Boulder Public Library. It was a classic red brick building tucked near the edge of the park, filled with sunlit reading alcoves and the soft scent of old paper. Dorian wasn't someone who visited libraries often, but he respected places that held quiet and answers. At the information desk stood a young librarian named Aaron, early 30s, wearing wireframe glasses, a mustard cardigan, and a genuine smile that reached his brown eyes. We're trying to trace someone, Dorian said, placing the printed photo of Mavis on the counter. Name might be Mavis Langley, possibly connected to Aurora or Boulder. I was hoping there might be record of her events attended, maybe even family mentioned in local news. Aaron's eyes flicked from the photo to Dorian, then to Max, who was sitting quietly at his heel. Give me a minute, Aaron said, already typing. Max shifted closer to Dorian, his little body warm against the cold tiles. Dorian reached down and gently scratched behind his ears. You've become part of the process now, he murmured. 15 minutes later, Aaron returned with a few clippings printed from the digital archives. Here, he said, placing the pages down. There was a Mavis Langley listed in a 2017 Garden Club article. Won second place for a lavender border in the city showcase. Same last name, pops up in a fundraiser for the Alzheimer's Care Center in Aurora, hosted by a June Langley. Dorian nodded, recognizing the photo from earlier. The woman in the garden. He took the pages, folded them carefully, and looked at Aaron. Thank you. Let me know if you need more, Aaron said. And your dog's very well behaved. He's new, Dorian replied with the hint of a smile. Still figuring things out. Seems like he's doing a great job. Outside, as they walked toward the car, Dorian glanced at Max. Well, assistant, what's next? Max barked and wagged his tail. That night, as snow began falling again in fine, misty strands, Dorian returned to the guest room. Mavis was awake, gazing at the fireplace flickering across the room. I remember lavender, she said quietly as he entered. Not much else. But I remember growing it. Rows of it. You did, Dorian confirmed. You even won an award. She smiled faintly. Did I? He showed her the article Aaron had found. Her eyes scanned the print, slowly stopping at the photo. That's me, she said softly. And that's June. Her face grew still. I have a daughter. Yes. We're trying to reach her now. She looked at him, then the confusion clearing for just a moment. You've done so much for me, and I don't even know your name. Dorian, he said. She reached over and laid a hand over his. Thank you, Dorian. Max jumped up beside her again, curling into the crook of her arm. She stroked his fur gently. And you, my little knight. Dorian exhaled slowly. Something was mending. And for the first time since Sarah's passing, he whispered the words aloud, half to Max, half to himself. Your family now? The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains as Dorian stood at the edge of the gravel driveway, the wind curling softly through the pine trees that lined his estate. He had changed into a navy wool sweater and dark jeans, less formal than his usual attire, but still immaculate. His gray eyes scanned the horizon, shifting between the long drive and the mountain peaks beyond. Max, the golden retriever puppy with fluffy light golden fur and wide curious eyes, stood beside him, tail flicking, with unspent energy. The call had come in earlier that morning, a quiet voice on the line. I'm June Langley. I was told, my mother is with you. Dorian remembered the tremble beneath her control, the disbelief braided with hope. He had given her the address, told her to take her time. She hadn't. Within hours, she was on the road from Aurora. The car appeared at last, a silver sedan, coated in a thin layer of slush from the mountain roads. It pulled to a stop with a gentle crunch, and the door opened. June stepped out. She was in her early 30s with sun-kissed olive skin and a slender frame wrapped in a thick green parka. Her dark brown hair was tied in a loose braid, a few strands tugged free by the wind. Her features were sharp but softened by emotion, high cheekbones, deep-set hazel eyes that immediately swept toward the house. There was something of her mother in her jawline, in the way her brow furrowed. Dorian approached slowly, hands in his coat pockets. "Miss Langley." She turned to him. "Yes, you're Mr. Hale." He nodded. "Dorian, she's inside, warm, safe, waiting." She exhaled as if she had been holding her breath since the phone call. Max trotted up to her and barked once, tail wagging in a frantic blur. She knelt instinctively, hands reaching out. "Who's this Max?" Dorian replied. "He's the one who found your mother." She laughed sudden and tearful as Max licked her palms, then sat and leaned into her knees like they had always known each other. "Good boy," she whispered. "Thank you." Inside the house, Mavis sat on the chaise lounge in the den, a blanket across her lap, her gaze distant but not vacant. She had been more alert that morning, recalling June's name without prompting. When she heard the front door open, she turned her head. June entered the room in 3 hesitant steps, and then collapsed to her knees. "Mama," she breathed. Mavis blinked eyes wide. Her lips trembled. "I know that voice," she whispered. June crawled forward and embraced her face pressed to her mother's shoulder. Mavis clutched at her awkwardly at first, but then held her tight, her hands in June's hair, trembling. Dorian stood at the doorway, unmoving. Max circled once, then curled beside them, tail thumping in slow rhythm. Later, the fire crackled in the hearth, as mother and daughter sat side by side. June had changed into a soft gray sweater, and Jean's hair now loose around her shoulders. She looked exhausted, but more at peace than when she arrived. She wandered from a care facility, Dorian asked gently, as they sat across from each other, mugs of tea in their hands. "Yes." June admitted, voice quiet. "I pulled her out against their advice. I thought I could give her better care, more love. But her episodes got worse. One night I went to sleep, and when I woke up, she was gone. Just gone. I searched the streets, called every clinic, every shelter. I thought she was dead." "You're not alone in that feeling," Dorian said softly. June looked up, eyes searching. "You've lost someone, too." He hesitated. "My wife. Years ago." "I'm sorry. She was a nurse. Sarah. Warm, brilliant, too good for this world. She died young. Cancer doesn't wait for anyone." June's eyes glistened. That's awful." They sat in silence for a while. Across the room, Max had planted himself between Mavis and June, his chin resting on Mavis's slippered foot. Every few seconds his tail flicked, as if reminding them he was there. "He's amazing," June said. "I've never seen a dog take to someone like that." "He's 1 month old," Dorian said. "Lost his whole litter. But somehow, he knew your mother needed him." June smiled through the wet shimmer in her eyes. "Sounds like he has a gift." Maybe, Dorian replied. Or maybe he just sees more than we do. Dinner was quiet but comfortable. June took over the kitchen, gently refusing Dorian's offers to help. He watched from the threshold as she moved, confident, graceful, yet grounded. The kind of woman who had spent years caring for others. Max lay at her feet the entire time, occasionally nudging her leg with his nose when something sizzled too loudly or the timer beeped. After the meal, they sat in the living room. June curled on the couch beside her mother, who had dozed off during the fire's glow. Max had migrated to the space between the fireplace and the couch, lying with his belly up in total trust. "You live alone here?" June asked, not prying, just curious. "I do," Dorian said. "It wasn't always this quiet, but I got used to it. You don't seem like the hermit type." He raised a brow. "No," she smiled. "You opened your home to a stranger in a wedding dress made of snow, and then to her daughter. That doesn't say hermit. That says heart." Dorian chuckled soft, low. "That might be the kindest thing anyone said to me in years." June tilted her head. "Then you've been listening to the wrong people." For a moment their eyes held, not long, not dramatic, but enough. Enough to know something had shifted, something soft and new had entered the stillness. That night, as the house grew quiet again, Dorian stepped into the guest room one last time. June lay on the pull-out daybed now, asleep under a heavy quilt. Mavis snored lightly in the main bed, peaceful, and Max. Max lay at the threshold between them, one paw stretched toward each bed like a bridge. Dorian smiled. Sometimes he thought miracles didn't come in thunders or signs. Sometimes they came in fur 4 paws and one persistent bark in the snow. The snow outside began to melt, slowly retreating from the porch steps and cobblestone paths that framed Dorian's secluded mountain home in Boulder. The sky, once a heavy gray ceiling, had softened into pale blue, and shafts of sunlight now filtered through the pines like cautious hope. Inside the house breathed differently. It was the 3rd morning since June had arrived. In the kitchen, a quiet hum of life buzzed where once there had only been silence. June, in a burgundy wool cardigan and faded jeans, stirred oatmeal over the stove. Her hair was messily tied in a knot, and the sleeves of her sweater were slightly flour-dusted from yesterday's baking session. She moved with instinct and warmth, tending to small chores like someone who belonged, not someone who had just arrived. Max, barely a month old, still soft and slightly wobbly, trailed behind her like a golden shadow. His light golden fur shimmered under the morning light, and his oversized paws patted softly across the stone floor. When June opened the fridge, Max sat. When she stepped to the sink, he followed. And when she bent to pour his breakfast into a ceramic bowl with his name etched on it, he wagged his tail so enthusiastically his tiny body nearly spun in place. Dorian watched from the hallway, coffee mug in hand. He had changed too, though not visibly. The man who once rose before dawn and stared into silence over black coffee now lingered in doorways longer, listening, observing. The graying at his temples was a little more pronounced this week, but it suited the stillness in his face. A quiet, thoughtful man, tall and broad-shouldered, he carried years of solitude not as a burden, but as something folded carefully into his character. In the den, Mavis rested in the recliner, a quilt across her lap, and sunlight warming her pale skin. She seemed calmer these days, her memory still patchy, but her eyes more focused. She had stopped asking, "Where am I?" and had started asking, "What time is breakfast?" Later that morning, June and Dorian found themselves on the back porch, cups of tea between them, and Max curled beside Dorian's feet, blinking sleepily. "It's strange," June said, blowing on her cup, "how quickly this place starts to feel familiar." Dorian didn't answer right away. He traced the lip of his cup, then looked out across the melting snow. "It hasn't felt like home for a long time." "Not really?" June glanced at him. "What changed, Max?" he said simply. She smiled. "Yeah? He's something. He came to me by accident," Dorian said. "A friend from California, breeder of working dogs, called me, said a litter had been abandoned after the mother died. Max was the runt. They thought he wouldn't make it. But he did." Dorian nodded. "I didn't plan to keep him, but I couldn't bring myself to give him away." "He found you?" June said softly. "And woke this house up," Dorian murmured. "For years it was just silence. After Sarah." He stopped, eyes distant. June waited. "She was a nurse. I met her in a hospital, nothing dramatic. I'd cut my hand on a glass shard at some fundraising event. She was on night shift, cleaned the wound herself. She laughed at my arrogance and called me corporate furniture. I asked her out 3 times before she said yes." June smiled. "What was she like?" "Brilliant. Brave. She taught me how to slow down, then life taught me how to stop." Silence settled between them, but not unkindly. Inside, Mavis stirred in her chair and called for June. The moment broke, and she rose with a nod. "I'll be right back." That afternoon, the 4 of them took a walk around the property. Max led the way, darting clumsily between patches of slush and gravel, his ears flopping wildly with every bounce. June pushed her mother gently in a wheelchair, borrowed from a local clinic, bundled in a thick wool blanket. Dorian walked beside them, his gloved hands occasionally adjusting Mavis's scarf or pointing out landmarks. "This is the East Garden," he said, nodding toward a fenced-in plot that was now mostly frostbitten soil. "Sarah used to plant lavender there." Mavis leaned forward slightly. "I like lavender." June's hand tightened on the handle. "Do you remember the garden at the old house?" Mama Mavis tilted her head. "I remember bees." June smiled. "That's a start." Max stopped, suddenly sniffing furiously at a patch near the fence. Then he barked once high-pitched and excited and dug his nose into the slush. "What did you find, boy?" Dorian asked. Max nudged something loose. June reached down and picked it up, a smooth river stone, painted purple with a faint heart drawn on it. Sarah's. She used to leave these, Dorian said, his voice low. One in every place she loved. Mavis turned the stone in her hand. "It's warm," she said, though it wasn't. June looked at Dorian, and for the first time she saw not a lonely man, but a man who had once loved deeply and still carried it in everything he touched. That night, after Mavis had fallen asleep, June lingered by the fireplace while Dorian poured 2 glasses of red wine. Max, already curled in a fluffy circle beside the hearth, blinked up sleepily before sighing into his paws. They sat in silence again, the kind of silence that felt like conversation. "Thank you," June said eventually, "for letting us stay, for all of this. You don't have to thank me. I do. You didn't have to take her in, or let me into your life. But you did." Dorian looked at her long and steady. "Maybe Max knew what I didn't. He is quite the matchmaker," she said, with a soft laugh. As if on cue, Max rolled over with a grunt and stretched toward both of them, one paw resting on each of their shoes. June glanced down, then back up. "He really does that a lot. Likes to be between people," Dorian said. "Maybe he's afraid we'll float away without him." "Well," June said gently, "I don't plan on going anywhere." Dorian didn't answer, but he smiled, and it was the kind of smile that had been waiting for years to return. The sky had turned a dull pewter that morning. Thick clouds stretched low and heavy across Boulder, like a blanket ready to burst. The forecast had mentioned light showers, but there was a restlessness in the air, an ache in the wind that hinted at something more. Inside the house, the morning had started quietly. Dorian had already left for a quick supply run, and June was in the laundry room folding towels. Mavis, who had seemed unusually alert the day before, had been left dozing in the sunroom, wrapped in her quilt, Max curled up by her feet like a warm patch of sunlight himself. The little golden retriever, now 5 weeks old and a bit sturdier than before, still retained his puppy softness, round belly light, golden fur, slightly damp from a morning romp, and those ever-curious eyes that caught everything. It was Max who noticed first. One moment he had been dozing beside Mavis. The next, he lifted his head ears, twitching. His eyes darted toward the now silent rocking chair. Empty. June heard his sudden bark echo through the hallway and came rushing in, towel still in her hand. "Max!" she called, alarm rising in her voice. The puppy was already pawing at the back door, whining sharply, tail-rigid nose pressed to the crack. June opened the door and stepped outside just in time to see faint footprints in the soft, wet soil leading toward the woods beyond the eastern edge of the property. Oh no. Mama. She didn't even pause to put on a coat. She grabbed her boots and followed the small golden blur of Max as he darted ahead through the trees, his bark sharper now, slicing through the cool, steady drizzle that had begun falling. The forest behind Dorian's estate wasn't dense, but it was disorienting. Tall pines loomed like silent watchers, and the winding trails, now muddy and slick, became a blur of earthy browns and pale green. June called out again and again, voice cracking, heart pounding. "Mama, Mama, where are you?" Max suddenly stopped barking frantically near a moss-covered fallen log. June ran to him and saw the faintest rustle behind the underbrush. There, hunched and shivering, was Mavis. The 70-year-old woman sat curled like a frightened child, her silver hair plastered to her forehead, with rain eyes wild and distant. Her wool blanket was soaked and clung to her like seaweed. She didn't recognize her daughter at first. June dropped to her knees, not caring that the mud soaked through her jeans or that her breath was coming in ragged gasps. "Mama," she whispered, tears mingling with the rain on her face. "I'm here. It's okay." Mavis looked up slowly, confusion softening as her eyes tried to focus. She blinked once, then twice. Her lips trembled. "June, yes. Yes, Mama. It's me." Max whimpered and nosed at Mavis's hand gently. June reached out and pulled her mother into a tight embrace, rocking her gently. There were no words, only touch warmth, the sound of raindrops through branches, and the silent language of love stitched through every heartbeat. Dorian arrived minutes later, his truck skidding slightly as it pulled into the drive. When he saw June emerging from the woods, cradling her frail mother against her chest, soaked from head to toe, Max bounding protectively beside them, something inside him shifted. He rushed toward them with an umbrella and dry blankets. What happened? She wandered off. June said, her voice hoarse. Max found her. I don't know how, but he knew. Dorian's eyes went to the pup now, muddy and soaked tail still wagging gently, and then to June. Her hair clung to her cheeks, her hands trembling slightly as she wiped her mother's face. She looked up at him, and in that moment, Dorian saw something more than gratitude. He saw someone who gave everything without needing a reason. Someone who carried pain like a cloak and still chose to love through it. He helped them both inside, set Mavis by the fire, and handed June a warm towel. She took it silently. Later that evening, after Mavis had fallen asleep and the rain had lightened to a soft mist, Dorian poured June a cup of chamomile tea and joined her on the couch. The room was dimly lit, the crackling fire casting gold against the dark wood walls. June sipped quietly. I'm sorry. I should have watched her more closely. It's not your fault, Dorian said. She has moments, and this morning none of us could have predicted it. She looked at him, tired but grateful. Max saved her. Again. He smiled faintly. He's got a better instinct for people than most humans I've met. They both turned to where Max now lay curled near the hearth belly, rising and falling gently, a small paw twitching in sleep. You look at her differently now, June said, her voice soft. What do you mean you looked at my mother like she mattered to you? She does, he said without hesitation. Then after a pause he added, so do you. The fire popped softly. Neither of them said anything more. Words didn't feel necessary. Outside, the rain eased into silence. The morning light filtered in softly through the tall windows of Dorian's home, golden and tentative like the sky itself. Wasn't sure whether to welcome the day or linger in the safety of sleep. The storm had passed, leaving everything damp and glowing. Outside, the trees still shimmered with raindrops, their leaves heavy and dark, as if mourning something soon to be lost. Inside, the atmosphere was subdued. Mavis was dressed in layers, a soft beige cardigan over a floral blouse. June had packed their bags, 2 modest suitcases that now sat by the front door. She moved through the house with a quiet resolve, her steps lighter than usual, as if she were trying not to wake something fragile. Or someone. Dorian stood in the hallway watching from a distance. He hadn't said much that morning. He wasn't the type to beg, but he had hoped, perhaps too quietly, that anything might keep her here. Max knew. Of course he did. The 1-month-old golden retriever puppy, still small and doughy in shape with fluffy light golden fur and deep brown eyes, had sensed it the moment June brought out the suitcase. He had followed her like a shadow all morning, trailing her as she folded sweaters, zipped compartments, checked her mother's medications. Now, as June approached the door, gently pulling her suitcase with one hand and resting the other on Mavis's arm, Max moved. He trotted to the front door, sat down directly in front of it, and lay flat across the threshold. June stopped. "Oh, Max," she whispered, voice catching. The puppy didn't move. His eyes looked up at her, soft and wet, and he let out a small, whimpering bark. Behind her, Mavis tilted her head slightly. Though her memory was still patchy, her emotions weren't. She reached down her wrinkled hand, brushing gently over Max's soft fur. June crouched beside him, her smile trembling as it fought to hold back tears. "You know, don't you? You know we're leaving." Max let out a soft grunt and buried his nose in her lap. The heat of his little body against her chilled fingers broke something inside her. She laughed, and then she cried. Dorian stepped forward, hands in his pockets, unsure if he was intruding. "He's not very good at goodbyes," he said gently. "Neither am I," he didn't say. June looked up at him, wiping her cheeks with the sleeve of her sweater. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but calm. "I didn't expect this to be so hard," she admitted. "You're not obligated to stay," he replied. "I know." A silence stretched between them, comfortable but heavy. I don't want to get in the way. You've built a life here quiet and beautiful. I'm just someone passing through." Dorian shook his head slowly. "No. You brought light into this place. And not just for Max." He paused, glancing down at the little golden pup, who now lay stretched across both their feet. "I used to grow lavender," he said suddenly, eyes distant, "in the backyard. My wife and I planted the garden together. After she died, I let it die too. Couldn't bear to touch it." June didn't speak. She waited, But I've been thinking," he continued, "we could plant it again. Maybe in the spring, if you're still around." His voice was calm, but something tender had crept in. Not a plea, a possibility, a beginning. June lowered her head, hair falling into her face, and smiled. "You're not asking me to stay." "No," he said. "I'm saying, if you want to, we could plant lavender." Behind them, Mavis looked between the two, and though her mind couldn't form the words, her heart understood. She took a seat quietly in the armchair, her eyes drifting to the window as Max padded over and curled at her feet. June rose and walked toward Dorian, standing just inches from him now. "What if it doesn't work?" she asked softly. He met her gaze without flinching. "Then we still tried." Outside, the sun broke fully through the clouds, and for the first time in days the sky was clear. They didn't kiss, they didn't need to. But June walked away from her suitcase, and that said everything. Spring arrived in Boulder like a soft-spoken guest. Quiet rains, shy blossoms, and air scented faintly with thawed earth and fresh beginnings. The trees no longer wore their skeletal forms. Instead, they blushed with pale green. It was a season of revival. And at the edge of a quiet hill, nestled behind a stone wall, lined with wildflowers, stood the house that had once belonged only to silence. Now it breathed. Max was no longer a waddling puppy. At 4 months old, he had grown longer, leaner, his golden fur now a richer hue that shimmered like butter under the Colorado sun. His paws were still a bit too big for his legs, giving him a clumsy charm that made people smile wherever he went. His ears were floppy, his eyes wide with curiosity, and he had developed a habit of dragging socks and small towels around the house like trophies. Inside, the once sterile mansion had transformed. The grand halls that once echoed with only Dorian's footsteps now sang with laughter, the rhythm of conversations, the soft humming of June as she watered the lavender they had planted in neat rows outside the kitchen window. June had stayed. Her mother Mavis still had good days and bad, but the good ones were lasting longer now. There was a quiet peace in her face that hadn't been there when Dorian first found her on that snowy roadside. On sunny mornings, she liked to sit in the sunroom with Max curled up at her feet, sketching with soft pencils and watercolors. Her hands trembled, but her strokes were sure. On one such morning, June emerged from the studio carrying a newly framed piece. Dorian was seated at the kitchen counter, sipping black coffee, reading the local paper. He looked up as June set the frame down before him. It was a painting. A small one-story house sat nestled between gentle hills. A pair of hands, delicate and weathered, were scattering seeds into a patch of soil. Near them stood a golden puppy alert and tail raised, surrounded by blooming lavender. Beneath the picture in Mavis's elegant handwriting were the words, "Home is where we find each other." Dorian stared at it for a long moment. "Your mother painted this." June nodded. Her smile was soft, touched with awe. She said she saw it in a dream. The first night we all slept under the same roof. He traced the frame's edge with his thumb. "It's perfect. She wants it hung in the living room, facing the front door." Max padded into the kitchen just then, dragging a slipper in his mouth, his tongue lolling slightly to the side. June laughed and bent down to pet him. "You approve, don't you?" The puppy gave an approving bark and promptly dropped the slipper at her feet. Later that afternoon, they planted new lavender. The air was cool but kind, and the soil was ready. Dorian wore gardening gloves, something he hadn't done in years. June knelt beside him, her fingers dirty, but her eyes gleaming. Mavis watched from a nearby bench, wrapped in a shawl, humming softly. Max, of course, was in the thick of it, digging holes that no one asked for, and getting thoroughly muddy. In the early evening, a neighbor dropped by, Mrs. Evelyn Hartman, a retired piano teacher in her 70s, with snow-white hair and a fiery wit. She had met June during one of the local charity bake sales and immediately taken a liking to her. Mrs. Hartman brought over a lemon tart and a tale about her runaway cat. She stayed for tea and offered Max half her tart under the table, claiming he had truthful eyes. Later, as the sun dipped low and the mountains turned gold, Dorian stood at the kitchen window, watching June and Mavis setting the table. They were laughing about something he couldn't hear, and Max was circling their feet like a satellite of joy. He hadn't known he could feel this full. That night when June tucked her mother into bed and returned to the living room, she found Dorian seated by the fireplace, Max asleep with his head on Dorian's foot. She didn't say anything. She just sat beside him, and that was enough. Sometimes what seems like a coincidence is just God's gentle way of reminding us no one is ever truly forgotten. Not a lonely billionaire, not a wandering old woman, not even a 1-month-old puppy who had just lost his mother. When Max barked that night, it wasn't just instinct, it was purpose. It was divine timing. In a world moving too fast to notice the quiet ones, sometimes it takes a small voice, a soft paw, a fragile memory, a whispered prayer to stop the rush and bring people home. Maybe you're feeling lost. Maybe someone in your life is slipping away, but there's still time, still love, still grace. If this story touched your heart, don't scroll away. Share it with someone who believes in second chances. Comment amen if you believe God brings the right souls together at the right time. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and join us. Because every week we tell the stories that heal. May God bless you and your loved ones today and always.
I swear, if that dog howls one more time tonight, you'll what, Greg? Throw your last beer can at it again. Greg's hand froze midair. The can hissed open anyway. He didn't answer Ellie. He just stared out the window, at the tree line. It was barely past 7, but the forest behind their trailer was already thick with shadows. The dog's howl came again, long, hollow, and cracked in the middle like something inside its chest had torn loose. That it had been 3 nights in a row. Same time, same place, same dog. Except no one owned a dog like that. Not around here. Not in this forgotten pocket of Buckthorn County where the last vet had left 5 years ago and most folks kept chickens, not pets. Ellie clicked off the lamp and pulled her cardigan tight, but her voice was steady. Something's wrong out there. You know it. Greg didn't reply. He rubbed his face, took a swig and reached for his flashlight. If it's rabid, we shoot it. Ellie's jaw clenched, but she followed him outside barefoot, the cold porch wood biting her skin. Behind them, their daughter Nola peeked through the screen door, the silence of a child too used to tension. The flashlight beam quivered in Greg's hand as they stepped into the woods. The dog wasn't howling anymore, but it didn't matter. It was waiting. They heard it before they saw it. Low breathing, measured steps just ahead in the undergrowth. When the beam finally caught it, Ellie gasped. The animal looked nothing like the neighbor's lab they'd once mistaken it for. It was taller, thinner, ribs ghosting through its fur, one leg trembling slightly as if it had walked too far for too long. But its eyes, they were bright with purpose, not wild, not lost. It turned and walked into the dark. Greg hesitated. I'm not following a damn stray through those woods. Ellie didn't wait. She moved past him, muttering, then stay behind and rot with the rest of them. The dog didn't look back, and neither did she. Branches clawed at her sleeves, roots caught her toes, but something in the dog's gait, not frantic, not afraid, pulled her forward. Behind her, she heard Greg curse once, then follow. They walked until the trees began to thin, and then they saw it, a clearing, small, sunken, silent, and in the center something, half-buried, something wrapped in cloth and time. Greg stopped breathing. Ellie fell to her knees. The dog sat beside the shape and waited, head bowed like it had been carrying the weight of memory for years. And just like that, the wind changed. The forest felt different, as if the truth beneath the soil had started to breathe again, and the town, though they didn't know it yet, would never sleep the same way again. Greg stood at the edge of the clearing, his flashlight still catching flecks of dust in the air, though he wasn't shining it on anything in particular. He was just holding it now, like a man gripping the last bit of sense left in him. Ellie crouched by the wrapped figure in the center, her hands hovering just inches above the worn cloth, too afraid to touch it but too shaken to pull away. The dog hadn't moved. It sat in the grass, panting softly, eyes on her, like it was waiting for her to do something it no longer had the strength to do itself. It's a child, Ellie whispered, her voice cracked and breathless. Greg, it's a child. Greg finally took a step forward. He didn't want to. Everything inside him screamed to turn around, to grab Ellie and march back to the trailer and forget this clearing existed. But some small, painful part of him, maybe the part that hadn't yet rusted through from years of loss, made him look. The cloth was tattered, yes, but unmistakably a quilt, old, hand-stitched. Someone had cared once. Someone had wrapped the body gently, carefully, not dumped, not discarded. He lowered the flashlight, and the beam caught something metallic poking from beneath the corner of the quilt. A rusted charm bracelet still fastened to a tiny wrist. Ellie sat back hard. This can't be real. The dog rose slowly and patted over. Its nose brushed the child's blanket. Then it turned its eyes to Ellie again, not pleading, but guiding, as if to say, there's more. Greg's voice was hoarse. We need to call someone who's Sheriff Briggs. He'll bulldoze this place and write it off as a vagrant overdose before he lets it make the paper. She was right. Everyone knew what happened to inconvenient things in Buckthorn County. Then we do it right, Ellie said, rising slowly. We don't stop here. They followed the dog deeper. The woods thickened again, curling inward like a clenched fist, branches knitted, so tight the moon could barely break through. Still, the dog moved with ease, weaving between roots and brambles like it had walked this trail 1,000 times before. Every now and then, it paused, sniffed, waited, and then it would keep moving, never once glancing back to check if they were still there. Greg fell once, scraped his knee, but didn't complain. Ellie caught her sweater on a thorn and let it tear. Neither of them spoke. It was as if words had become too clumsy for what was unfolding. Whatever this was, then they came to the creek. It was barely a trickle now, just enough to glisten under the pale light. On the far side, something unnatural glinted in the mud. Ellie crossed first, stepping carefully on the flat stones. When she reached the other side, she froze a box wooden child, dash-sized dot inside. Matted cloth, cracked dolls, a shoe and bones, not fresh, weathered, old, but unmistakably human. Greg stood beside her, his breathing shallow. How many? Ellie didn't answer. She couldn't. Her hands hovered over the items, trembling. She looked at the dog. Why? The dog turned and walked a few paces back toward the trees. Then it barked. Once. Ellie followed Greg behind, dazed now. And then they saw it, an old well-boarded, roped, almost hidden beneath a tangle of vines and wild thistle. Carved into the wood above it, almost invisible in the dark, were letters. Carved by hand. Names. Dozens of them. Ellie, breath caught. She reached out, ran her fingers over one. Myra, another JJ, a third Tansy. Names she remembered. Names that had been whispered in church halls. Names on milk cartons in grocery stores long since shuttered. Oh my God, Greg murmured, staggering back. All those missing kids. They weren't runaways. Ellie's voice was hollow. They were right here the whole time. The dog sat beside the well, not proud, not vindicated. Just tired. And then Ellie remembered something, a story from years ago. Something she had tried to forget. A man with bad teeth and worse eyes, who used to run the lumber mill before it shut down. He lived just past the ridge, alone, and disappeared one winter without a word. Folks said he skipped town. Some said he died in his sleep. But Ellie remembered his backyard, remembered that her cousin had dared her once to peek through the slats of his shed. She hadn't seen much. Just a pile of cloth and a lantern, and something that looked like a child's bicycle, and now she wondered how many others had seen and walked away. Greg sat down, suddenly old. He took off his cap and rubbed his face with shaking hands. What are we supposed to do with this? We tell, Ellie said quietly. We dig, we document, we shine a light so bright they can't ignore it. And if they try, then we howl, she said, turning to the dog. Like you did. The dog wagged its tail once, a tired, brittle arc, and lay down beside the well that night. The wind moved through Buckthorn County like a whisper finally given voice. And in homes across the town, people stirred without knowing why. In dreams. Some heard barking. In dreams. Some heard names. But only 2 people and 1 dog knew the truth. Was no longer buried. The first shovel hit the earth with a thud that seemed to echo louder than it should have. Greg's hands trembled slightly as he dug, the old army shovel barely slicing through the damp roots and packed clay. Ellie stood beside the dog, arms crossed tightly across her chest, her breath hitching every time the blade scraped something solid. They hadn't spoken since they found the bundle. Neither of them dared to guess aloud what lay beneath. The dog hadn't moved, not once. It just sat there like a gravestone that had been waiting to be read. Nola stood at the edge of the clearing, now barefoot and silent, her small face pale with a knowing that didn't fit her age. She had followed them without a word, and neither parent had noticed until it was too late. But somehow, it felt like she was meant to be there. Like the dog had known she would come. Then the sound changed. The next shovelful lifted something, lighter than earth, frayed cloth, stained by time and soil. Greg's breath caught in his throat as the fabric peeled back and something glinted softly beneath it. A locket. Still closed. Still gold. Still resting against what was unmistakably a child's sleeve. A faded yellow sleeve with hand-stitched daisies along the cuff. Ellie's knees buckled. Oh God, she whispered. Is that? Her voice failed her. Greg knelt beside the hole, touching the edge of the fabric with a gentleness Ellie hadn't seen in years. I don't know, he murmured. But we need to call the sheriff. But the dog moved first. It stood up slowly, walked to the shallow grave, and lay down beside it, not in grief, but as if keeping watch, as if returning to where it belonged. That's when Ellie noticed the old leather collar under its matted fur. The nameplate was rusted, but a few letters remained. F.I.G. Fig, she whispered. Her voice broke on the word. That's not possible. Fig went missing when we were kids. That was Grace's dog. She turned to Greg, eyes wide, stunned. Don't you remember? When her sister disappeared, and they never found. Greg's face had gone pale. Ellie, are you saying that? She nodded slowly, her breath catching. This is her. This is Clara. The memory hit like a wave. Clara Rhodes, the sweet, quiet girl who lived on Millstone Road, went missing. The summer of '97. One day she was picking wildflowers with her sister. The next she was gone. The whole town searched for weeks. They dragged the pond, searched barns, prayed. And Fig, her dog, had vanished the same night. Everyone assumed it had run off, scared, or worse. But now Fig had brought them back. Greg sat down hard beside the hole, his hands covering his face. Why here? Why now? Ellie stared at the dog, tears running silently down her cheeks, because she was never found, because no one listened, because someone buried her and hoped she'd disappear. They sat in silence as the sun began to rise over the clearing, and the frost on the grass melted into soft dew. For the first time, the woods didn't feel like just trees and dirt. They felt alive, heavy, watching. Then came the voice. "Is that your daughter?" Greg and Ellie turned sharply. A man stood at the edge of the trees, lean, tall, and in his 70s, with a face carved by weather and guilt. They didn't recognize him at first, but when he stepped forward, Greg's jaw clenched. "Walter Delaney," Greg muttered. "I thought you were long gone." Walter nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the grave. "I was moved out the year after it happened." His voice was hoarse, like it hadn't been used in a long while. "But I came back when I heard about the dog." Ellie stood slowly, her posture rigid. "What?" Walter's eyes glistened, and for a moment the man seemed to shrink. "Because I knew what I'd done, and I thought maybe Fig would come for me, too." Greg rose, fists clenched, but Ellie put a hand on his arm. "What do you mean, what you've done?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. Walter looked down, ashamed. "I was the groundskeeper at the old mill back then. Clara used to wander that way, picking flowers. I caught her once. I told her to leave. Next time she snuck inside. I didn't mean to. It wasn't supposed to happen like that." His voice broke. "I panicked. She hit her head. I buried her here. Fig tried to stop me, wouldn't leave her side. I couldn't bring myself to shoot him." Greg lunged, but Ellie held him back. Walter just stood there, accepting whatever would come next, and yet the dog didn't growl, didn't move. He only looked at the man with tired eyes, then turned back toward the grave and rested his chin beside the yellow sleeve. The wind picked up, soft, stirring leaves but not scattering them, like breath held for too long. Ellie stepped forward. "You're turning yourself in." Walter nodded. "I will. I just wanted to see her one last time." No one spoke again, but the silence wasn't empty. It was full of something old and unfinished, grief, maybe, or peace, or both. As the sun reached the edge of the clearing, the dog stood up, gave one final look at the three of them, and without sound or hesitation walked back into the trees. And this time no one followed. The first shovel hit a root. Not a sound from the dog. Not a word between Greg and Ellie. Only the soft thud of earth being lifted, shaken loose, and piled beside the shallow pit. The smell of old bark and damp moss clung to the air like something ancient had been holding its breath beneath these trees. And now it was exhaling. By the third dig, the cloth was clearer, grayed with age, torn in places. Something about the stitching felt deliberate. Greg paused. Ellie crouched closer, brushing away dirt with her bare hands. Slower now, gentler, like she was uncovering more than just fabric. It was a quilt, a child's quilt. Faded flowers on one side, the edge embroidered with the name Mirren. The moment her fingers touched the letters, the dog whimpered, not loud, but enough. Ellie looked up sharply. "She's not from now," Ellie whispered, voice hollow. "This cloth, it's decades old." Greg ran a hand through his thinning hair. "You're telling me this dog dragged us through a forest to find a blanket from 50 years ago?" Ellie didn't answer. Her hand slid beneath the quilt, and when she pulled, something else shifted in the earth. Wood rotten but shaped. Cornice. Greg knelt beside her, heart pounding louder than the wind. It was a box, no, a coffin, but small. Inside, wrapped in layers of cloth and shadow, was a bundle no bigger than a toddler. Bones, tiny bones, tucked like a sleeping child, one brittle hand clutching a stuffed rabbit worn down to threads. Greg stood up, staggered back, eyes wide with something too old for fear. The dog stayed seated, still, as if it had done this before. It was Ellie who saw the second object, just beside the bones, sealed in a rusted tin. She pried it open with the edge of a rock. Inside, a photograph, black and white. A young woman in a nurse's uniform holding the same rabbit. Behind her, a wooden sign, Buckthorn Children's Asylum -1954. Beneath the photo, in the faintest ink, one sentence. "She cried for 3 nights. No one came." Ellie turned cold. "I've heard of that place," Greg murmured. "They shut it down. Abuse allegations. Children vanished. Whole thing buried, literally." Apparently, Ellie didn't move. Her eyes stayed fixed on the bones. "They never found the bodies," she said. "Just locked the gates and let the forest eat it." The wind moved through the trees like a whisper of something long forgotten. The moment stretched too long. Then the dog stood and walked away. Without speaking, they followed. Deeper now. The trail twisted past blackened trees, moss-covered stones, and eventually through what looked like the remains of iron fencing swallowed by decades of growth. There it was, the asylum. Half-dash collapsed, swallowed by ivy and silence. One side sagged inward like the forest had tried to crush it into the earth. Windows broken, doors splintered, but something about it still felt intact, as if memory lived here in the walls. The dog walked straight through the doorless frame. Greg hesitated, but Ellie pressed on. Inside, mold crawled up the walls like veins. rusted beds, a child's shoe, a broken clipboard, names, faded names, scrawled in chalk across the peeling walls, and then a sound, not the dog, not wind, a tiny distant cry, barely audible, almost imagined. Ellie turned pale. Did you? Greg nodded. They followed the sound through a corridor of collapsed beams and rotting floorboards until they reached a door that hadn't fully fallen. The dog stopped beside it. Its tail didn't wag, it just waited. Greg pushed it open. Inside. The air felt wrong, heavy, not stale but sad. There were drawings on the walls in colored pencil, cracked and faded, stars, rabbits, trees, a child's handwriting. When mommy comes, I'll leave. In the center of the room sat a low wooden crate, and on top of it, something impossible. A freshly placed candle still warm, a flame flickering. Ellie backed up. That's not from decades ago. Greg's voice was tight. Someone's been coming here. The dog lay down beside the crate, not protectively like a sentry, like it had done this over and over, every night for who knows how many years. Leading, waiting, remembering. Suddenly, Greg turned. We need to tell someone. This is more than a grave. This is a story the town buried, and someone's still feeding it. Ellie didn't answer right away. Her gaze stayed on the candle. The dog's not just a stray, she whispered. He was bringing us here for a reason. They left the building in silence. The forest didn't feel the same on the way out. It felt older, thicker. The trees seemed to lean closer. When they finally reached the road again, the sun was gone. Nola stood on the porch holding Ellie's old coat, her face pale. Mama, she said quietly, the dog's outside my window. Every night he always stares at the same place. Ellie knelt, voice trembling. Where, sweetheart? Nola pointed toward the creek. That old well. Greg turned, and his mouth went dry. He remembered something from when he was 6. A girl who lived down the hill, a game of hide and seek, a scream that got swallowed before it reached the sky. The dog was already walking again down the trail behind the house, slowly, silently, toward the well. This time, none of them hesitated. The night was far from over, and whatever the dog had come to show them next, it had been waiting a long, long time. They reached the well just after dusk, the last glow of day flickering out behind the hills like someone slowly dimming a lamp. The stones were old and crooked, laced with moss, and the rusted bucket hung halfway down the shaft, swaying slightly though no wind touched it. The dog stopped at the edge, paused right against the lip, and sat down as if it had led enough hearts to this place and now only needed someone willing to look. Greg moved first, his breath shallow, hands shaking. He picked up a long branch and lowered it carefully down. No splash, just air. Deep, dry silence. Ellie stood beside him, gripping Nolan's shoulder with one hand, the other pressed over her chest. She hadn't stopped shaking since the photo at the asylum. This well, it wasn't just a place anymore. It was a memory too long ignored. Then came the sound, faint, metallic, like something shifting in the dark below. Nola stepped forward. I heard that last night, she whispered, exactly like that. Then the dog barked once and left. Greg looked at her, the lines in his face deeper than ever. You never told us. Nola didn't look away. I thought it was just dreams. The dog barked again, a single low sound that made the skin on their necks rise. Greg knelt and lowered the flashlight. The beam flickered against something that shouldn't have been there, a glint of metal, then fabric, a box wedged in the stone crevice, just above the bottom. They brought it up together. It wasn't large, but it was heavy with time. Inside, sealed in layers of wax paper and brittle lace, was a journal. Children's drawings filled the first pages, trees, stars, rabbits. Then came names. Over a dozen each written in shaky hand, all girls, all lost. And at the back, one final entry, written with heartbreaking clarity. If they find this, please tell our mothers we remembered them every night, even when the grown-ups said they never would. Greg couldn't speak. Ellie cried, quiet and slow. Nola simply pressed her hand over the dog's head and leaned into his side. And the dog exhaled, long and low, and closed his eyes. They buried the journal near the clearing where Mirren had been found, beneath the roots of a white ash tree. Ellie marked the spot with a stone. No name, no plaque, just presence. A place to come back to. In the weeks that followed, people came forward, old families, forgotten records, a quiet reckoning. The town council reopened the asylum site, and for the first time in 70 years, Buckthorn acknowledged what it had silenced. Names were read aloud under lantern light, not as victims, as children, as voices once unheard. And the dog, he stayed for one more night. Then, without ceremony, he walked back into the woods. No collar, no trail, just a final glance over his shoulder. Before the trees swallowed him whole, Greg stood watching long after the last paw print faded. He wasn't just leading us, he said, he was remembering. Ellie didn't reply. She only took Nolan's hand and watched the forest close like a book that had waited too long to be read. Somewhere in that silence, a breeze stirred the ashes, lifting a corner of the buried quilt. And as the stars blinked open above them, it felt like something small and sacred had finally been laid to rest. And in that quiet space between grief and grace, the town of Buckthorn began to heal.